finished yesterday, and you may want to say some things about them. So we're talking about the life under Rue Neuve. Before we get to that General Assembly, now, of course, the part of the problem here is that what are we going to do about the sequence? But since we're talking about, first of all, is there anything more about that business of the vows? All right, and so Frank asked about, what about authorization for this? Remember, these were private vows which anybody can make any time, preferably under the direction of a spiritual director. And so, although they all took them, for each one it was a private vow, and the only binding force was the force that it had before God. The Institute has no public vows until the Bull of Approbation comes 6 years after the death of the founder. So all of these vow things are purely private commitments before the Lord. And there is therefore only that intrinsic binding force, which to my mind is the only intrinsic binding force that vows have anyway. But so that's anything about vows. All right, now what about the habit? So the habit probably was adopted before this business of before the assembly, and I passed out that sheet from Maurice Hermans, and maybe there's a couple of things he says about the habit on that page. Have you got it? The first taking of the habit at Reims in 1684. See, Maurice was very conscious of the fact that we were observing the 300th anniversary of all these things. On the second page, see, this is the same point we've been talking about. His whole point is that this was a way of going public. This, after a couple of years together, 4 years actually, since the foundation of the first school, this group of schoolmasters, which is now totally under the control of John Baptist de La Salle, and with the 6 or 7 schools operating, that they decide that it's time for let everybody know that what they're up to, and that there's something different. Okay? So he says in the last 3 paragraphs here of this second page, that first taking of the habit was meant precisely to witness to this fact. He has interesting things up above about why there are no hooks and things up, why there are no buttons. Before their pupils, before the parishioners of Reims, Rethel, and elsewhere, the brothers, wearing this habit, professed. See, the word profession, This is the profession. Their membership of a community, which was not to be confused with any other. Neither ecclesiastic, they weren't diocesan. Neither secular, they were not ordinary lay people, nor regular. Regular, of course, means belong to a religious order, which Bland consistently forgets. He's always bringing in what other religious orders do, in the sense in which the church understood. So from a technical, canonical sense of what is an ecclesiastic, a member of an order, a regular order, or a secular, the disciples of Monsieur de La Salle insisted on their identity as brothers of the Christian schools. Since the adoption of this habit, states the memoir, a person has no other idea when he asks for admission but to join a community and remain there for the rest of his life. This is 2 years before they take a vow. He does not know what it is to ask for wages and considers himself happy to be accepted. It is the habit alone which produces these effects. So, and it's preserved in the Mother House. Anybody want to say anything about that? Now, of course, the business of ridicule, as I suggested, there was an incident, apparently a severe incident one time in Rouen, where the brothers they threw stones and mud and so on and so forth. But Bland has them doing that all day, every day, which is very unlikely. But the habit was a very distinctive thing. Are you all familiar with what the habit looked like? You got a kind of an idea of it last night when Pat McNally appeared and of course the founder kept making the brim wider and wider and wider. Here's a picture. It's in Battersby. It's also in my biography. But there's what the habit looked like, Now it doesn't look like what brothers wear around our schools now. Can you kind of see that? So there's the broad brim hat flopping all over the place. It wasn't the tricorps, the three-quarter job, or the Roman hat, all of which were adopted much later. But this was the floppy thing with the big, thick boots and the robe coming down only to the just at the calf, just below the knee, because the ecclesiastics liked to wear them all the way down to the ground, and that was an excuse very often for having a little train behind, because your status in ecclesiastical circles depends on how long your train is. I remember when we were scholastics in Washington, and so they'd have these big ceremonies in the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. And on some big days, like the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, which was the patronal feast of the United States and the university, etc., they'd have a whole procession of archbishops and the apostolic delegate. They usually didn't have a cardinal, because if a cardinal came, it would upset who was head of who. But then they all had these big, long Capa Magna things with a big, long train behind, carried by some little altar boy and the thing. Now, you know the origin of that, of course.
No.
Well, when these bishops would travel around, of course, they traveled by horse. And so when they sat on the horse with these big, long capes and so on, the thing had to be long enough to keep the horse's ass warm. That's the origin of the thing. So every bishop had a horse and a horse's ass, but it was a Well, anyway, so the founder wanted none of that. There was no temptation that you'd have a train or a train bearer with that type of an outfit. And then, of course, underneath they just wore little short pants. John Paul II created a scandal when he was first elected Pope, when he wore black pants underneath his white robe. That's the first Pope in history ever to wear a pair of pants, for crying out loud. He soon got rid of them, by the way. So all they ever wore underneath were these big, long stockings called the ba, B-A-S. They say that in the general chapter of 1923, the major issue for discussion in that general chapter was whether or not the brothers would have to continue to wear the ba and what they would be made out of. Those long stockings, little short pants, and then a kind of an undershirt, which they changed once a week, whether they needed it or not. Well, so that's the habit. Anything about the habit? Yes, Chris?
Luke, on the paper that you gave us,
yes.
There's Maurice writes, he therefore wrote this in order to justify his decision in the eyes of his ecclesiastical superiors.
Yes, well, we'll come to that. We'll talk about it here. Let's wait till Paris for that. We'll talk about the memoir. I just want to the significance of the habit at this point. So they established several policies at this meeting. The habit had already been adopted. They decided from now on they're going to be called brothers and not school teachers. They will only go to schools. The founder had already seen the importance of that, 2 by 2, that he would not send a brother anywhere alone. And what else? Am I forgetting something? But those are the basic decisions of that first General Assembly. And he did it together, and at the end, then they discussed the business of vows. They finally decided, well, yes, some of them are ready to make a vow of obedience, which they did, and the next day they made a pilgrimage, all starting early in the morning and fasting, walking the 30 miles or so to the Shrine of Our Lady in Liesse. It's about 25, 30 miles. So they walked up there, got there in time for Mass, left early enough in the morning, got there in time for Mass, which the founder celebrated. They renew their vows in that chapel, which is still there, and you can still visit it. And I explained there's the stained glass window there. I have a slide of it I may show you if we get around to that. And then they came back that same day. So that's that chapter. Now, one of the things that coming to more of those things on the life in the Rue Neuve, a lot of you were concerned about this business of, well, you've been using the word occult. Do you mean sect, huh? Well, we have to think, what about those 3 brothers who died? Huh? One of them, by the way, was De La Salle's pet. You know, he had a special liking for this one. He was selective, apparently, that Morris. And the Bourlet fellow, these people came from pretty good families, as the story goes. Have you any comment on that? And here they were lacerating themselves. About 6 of them died, and Arose has gathered the death certificates of some of them. They're all dying very young, popping off with the austerity and everything. And there's evidence, too, that when they began to die, the founder as you'll see in the beginnings thing, the founder then began to mitigate some of the things that they had agreed to do as part of their lifestyle thing. But that often has, in any of these things, a beginning. It's, the Moonies thing, when we read about, you don't hear so much about them anymore. Of course, as you know, they have a training center in what was our novitiate in Barrytown. And I remember when they first settled in there was one of them who left and was disillusioned with them, wrote a big article for the New York Daily News, a big expose of what was going on up there in Barrytown with the Moonies. And he said it was inhuman, the existence they had. They got up at the crack of dawn in the morning, very early in the morning. They had them working out in the fields without any pay. The food was meager and barely enough to subsist on. They were not allowed to, their parents were not allowed to come and visit them, and they had no contact with the outside world. They were brainwashed all day long into the Mooney philosophy and so on and so forth. And I felt like saying, well, what else is new? That's exactly what they did to us. And it was. It's the same technique, and it's the same tactics, and the social control, and the thought control, and everything else, and so on and so forth. And then a whole structure, an international structure, whereby the visiting general would come around and report directly to the superiors in Rome, and skipping over all of the provincials in between, so that there was no way anybody could escape from this surveillance. And one time my father was a traveling salesman. That's where I got some of my stories. And so one time he was in the neighborhood, and I saw the family car parked over there by the juniorate, and he knew one of the brothers there. And so I saw the family car, and I said, oh, God, my father's here, and so on and so forth. But apparently he came to the director of novices and asked if he could see me. So the director of novices said, sure, yes, you may see dear brother Celestin Luke. But he said, of course, he has only 4 visits a year, so if you see him this time, that counts as one of them. So he figured he didn't want to sacrifice the family visit. So those were the days, my friend. Would you want to call our novitiate, the seed beds of a sect or something like that? Is that what was behind those questions? Does somebody want to pursue that further? But you see, it's anybody who started, the sociologists have analyzed this when they talk about charism, that you have the charismatic leader surrounded by his early, fervent, all-excited disciple. As I said a little earlier,
why would Black put so much emphasis on these disciplines?
Because of the spirituality of the time. We've seen that over and over and over again.
But I mean, even with people who were novices or just joining the group, they would all be using.
Well, sure. That doesn't strike us older ones as quite so strange, because although we didn't get very much into this business of corporal penance and all that, there was a fair amount of it. We were told, for example, that our director of novices wore a hair shirt sometimes, and he would describe to us these instruments of penance, and it was all part of spirituality and identifying with Jesus crucified and all that. And so, first of all, we were often humiliated for the least little thing, and that was part of the trial of the test, and you were encouraged. Now, we didn't get too much into the things they were doing in the 17th century. After all, we were in the 20th century. But there was a sort of a taste for this, and among some of the novices, they began to do crazy things like that. We had a couple in our group. We used to call them scoops, but they put pebbles in their shoes, and all sorts of little things, or sleep without the pillow, or penance. You have to take your meals on your knees. Most of us managed to get that penance on. If you could, you tried to get it on Friday, which was a fast day, because you could eat more underneath the table. Nobody knew what you were doing. So it didn't strike us as so strange. So this is part of the spirituality time. All the spiritual writers were writing this. You have to wonder about the psychological dimension of it, though, don't you? Might have been a way of getting the jollies after all. You can beat animals and you can beat a rug, but you can't beat sex, you know, so you have to find some sort of a substitute for it, I suppose. And so this may have been, that's perhaps a judgment. But you do have to wonder a little bit about because when you get carried away.
I was struck by the food. They talk about the delicate constitution of LaSalle. Did Blaine really exaggerate that, you think? Or was that something about special?
Yeah, well, Gus made the point that he was delicately brought up, but he was brought up in a relatively wealthy bourgeois home where they would be served the finest foods, huh? They would have what I suppose today we'd call gourmet cooking, served in a series of several courses and very delicately and all that. And nothing but, where these characters, they're eating oxtails and I suspect dogs and cats and rabbits and everything else, if there was meat at all, huh? And then for vegetables, it was like during the war in Washington where the econom would go up to the market and buy all the stuff that everybody else had thrown out, the kale and all that. And then we'd have to pick out the good pieces during manual labor in the morning that would serve us the meal at noontime. So, you know. So that, and of course the soup, you could be sure, was greasy, huh? They'd use old cuts of pork and everything else, and to get that stuff down after that type of a diet for the first 30 years of your life, sure, it would have been different.
One thing that bothers me that you have referred to is our founder is a great saint because there was a near perfect matching between his behavior, his attitude, and the French school. And since that was so, they became a canonized saint. Therefore, if I'm to imitate the founder, I should find some new spiritual trend today, like, let us say, liberation, and I should latch on to the tenets and the canons of liberation theology, and if, in my case, there's a near matching between that, like our founder, people will think I'm great.
Yeah, the only trouble with that is you're in the wrong continent. If you want to develop a spirituality out of liberation theology, you have to be in South America, not North America. See, that's a very important point. Liberation theology it's a theology, but it is a spirituality that operates really only in countries where there's a need for liberation, such as there is in Latin America, such as does not exist. That's why we've heard people talk about we ought to have a theology and a spirituality of affluence in North America. No, but I mean you're basically right. No, but we have to relate to God. Huh? We have to relate to God, and we have to develop a spirituality in the context of a relatively affluent society, and that's part of the problem, huh? Because the society is not only affluent, but it's highly secularized, and we have to somehow be part of that. We can't help but be part of it, and there's a tremendous optimism in our society about the body, for example. This business we were talking about last night of praying, of making mental prayer in front of a mirror, stark naked, you know. Well, you know, maybe that's the way, that's an adaptation to a mentality that exists in our society of healthy respect for the body and thanking God for it. So of course you're right. So you know, it's getting a little late in the day for you and me and Gus and so on to find the right spirituality to it, because we're going to be saints pretty soon. So if you haven't found it by now, you'd better hurry up. Where were we? Anything else on? Yes.
One quick question. On Blaine's page 20 in the book, too, he says it was called the Christian and Gratuitous Schools, Brothers of the Christian and Gratuitous Schools. When did that word gratuitous schools drop out in the title?
I guess at this assembly, because from then on they are the Brothers of the Christian Schools, as far as we know, huh? But the title of the society keeps getting shifted around a good bit as time goes on. Gus, you look like you want to say something. No? I talked about the little Blam pulls the Martha and Mary thing about De La Salle. De La Salle reluctantly, now this of course is something I find difficult, that all he wanted to do was be making meditation, and anything else for him was a distraction. Reminds me of when we arrived in Rome for the general chapter of 1966. For the Nice, we started the chapter with a retreat. And Nice told us all, well, now, he says, we will all be genuinely religious for the first time since last year when you were on retreat. We will no longer have the distractions of the apostolic work. He didn't say apostolic work, of our ordinary routine life. But now we are truly going to be religious for the first time. And we went into 4 days of a monastic routine. And that was the mentality that prevailed. And even the word work, that no, it was important to be religious. And this was not De La Salle's attitude. If all you got to do is read this stuff to realize how busy he was and how much attention he had to pay to the brothers, to contracts, to deals with pastors, and so on and so forth, to all of those long travels and so on. And yet he was able to maintain through all that the fantastic sense of the presence of God and to be able to pray at great length and enter into these spiritual practices and so on and so forth. But it was not a question of Martha and Mary. And, well, there's a lot of things to be said about the exegesis of Martha and Mary. Notice on page 42, something that illustrates very well what I was saying about the Sulpician school of spirituality, right just about plunk in the middle of the page. All he read in the gospel in the life of the Lord of the universe were examples of submission and dependence. Okay. There is not one of his, capital H, that is Christ. There is not one of Christ's mysteries, that is simply an event in the life of Christ, because it's part of the mystery of the incarnation, that does not afford us some instance of a particular kind of obedience. Notice the kenosis, the spirituality of subject to the laws of nature. He remained for 9 months in his mother's womb without trying to hasten the moment of his birth. There's little fetus Jesus, in his mother's womb, anxious to get going and get on his life's work and so on, but he's patient enough to wait for 9 months until it's time for him to pop out. But that's a perfect example of identifying with a mystery in the life of Christ, according to the spirituality. And a good bit of the devotion to Mary centers around that notion that Jesus was there in her womb, waiting and relating to her and everything else and so on during all that time. Page 46. I don't have the French, but it'd be interesting to see when it's a question of the top of the page. Whatever was most lowly, most demeaning, most distasteful in the household chores was what he preferred. He managed to choose those tasks or having them assigned to him: sweeping, washing dishes, carrying out the garbage, cleaning the restrooms. Well, the restrooms, of course, were outdoor toilets, needless to say. There was no indoor plumbing. And here he puts it as a typical thing that the founder did. But then later on, he relates the story of Bartholomew when the founder thought he had permission to go and clean the outhouse to get some straw and so on. And Bartholomew said, "Hey, no, I wouldn't let you do that." So there's another one of those examples of contradiction. The word restroom is certainly glossing over a very ugly reality, as you know if you've ever been in an outdoor camp where that's the only facility available. He has an interesting exegesis on the rule about in recreation not to talk about anybody who's living, that he had to modify it except to speak well of them. What about lapping up the soup on the floor? Yes.
What about all these worms in the soup and stuff?
Yeah, what about that? Well, I wouldn't be surprised if that happened from time to time. It used to happen to us once in a while too. The old thing, well, that's one way of getting protein, or there's a worm in my soup, don't worry, it won't eat much. So, then the whole business of Henri Leroux, and picking off Henri Leroux, sending him off to study, and so on and so forth. And of course, he follows the story all the way to the end, even though this doesn't happen until later on in Paris. And then the tremendous emotion that he shows on page 53. Naturally, John, so here he's introduces Henri Leroux, says the founder wanted to make him a priest, and then he kills him off on the next page already. The end of that next to the last paragraph. Prudent, wise, endowed with good judgment and sufficient learning, filled with zeal, the spirit of a state, he was entirely capable of causing the holy founder, who loved him so much, to live again in his person. De La Salle loved him and honored him and entertained the fondest hopes. Naturally, he could not be sensible. But down below, the saddest events seem unable to penetrate. But on this occasion, his emotions and his grief clearly appeared. Only for a quarter of an hour at most, however, after this brief space of time, he recovered his usual attitude of peace, thanks to his entire submission to God's will and abandonment. So he really felt this pretty bad, the death of Henri Leroux. But it's premature to introduce it at this point. He wouldn't give anybody his blessing. The whole business of women in spiritual direction. The business of the now he starts a big campaign against the schools and the schoolmasters here because they're punishing the students. I am very inclined to think this did not happen in Reims. Again, that may have been part of the campaign against him in Paris when the Compagnon here is trying to get after him and so on. But it seems very unlikely, this extended discussion of the using excessive corporal punishment to these rowdy kids who deserved every bit of it and so on and so forth. All right. Then we have the foundation of the School for Country Schoolmasters, and then the foundation of a juniorate for the juniors, so that by the time he's finished here in the Rue Neuve, he's got this group of ecclesiastics with a sort of a seminary operating there. He's got the community brothers who are teaching. He's got this school operating for country schoolmasters, and he's got a group of juniors being all prepared. And of course, again, De La Salle, Blanc can't help carrying the story of the juniors all the way to Paris, where he'll tell it again when we get to that. So he was not one to give the answer, we'll get to that. He puts all these things in right away.
Right away.
Right away. Then you can say we already had it by the time you get to it, because it spoils the sequence. So that's all that I want to highlight with this. Is there anything more now before we leave the founder and Reims? I'm kind of rushing over some important things at the end there, but I presume you've read it and understand the significance.
Am I bothering you?
Go ahead. Well, I'm glad you added the too much. The answer to the first is yes, and the second, no.
I'm moving back just a bit, but it's a very general question, you see. This is in the first thing, page 88, and I quote, De La Salle, however, did not like to rush into things and did not wish to do anything without the advice of his ordinary director of conscience. Now, from that, I conclude he had a hierarchy of 3 directors of conscience: his ordinary, his extraordinary, and his crisis director of conscience. Now, am I reading too much into that?
Yes.
Huh?
I think so. I think what that means, yes and no is the answer. As we saw, I think he always had one spiritual director that was considered his regular director. It was probably Tronçon in Paris, then it became Roland until Roland died, then it became Jacques Collot as long as it was in Reims. But as we saw, if he didn't like what the director was saying or was convinced God wanted something else, he had no hesitancy about going to somebody else, to Barré, for example, or to somebody else that he thought could give him some advice. So I think Blan's referring to, but I don't think he hierarchized them that way. I mean, that's Blan's expression. But he's referring to the ordinary one, probably Calou. Okay.
Just on that, Blan seems to accept that, or he seems to say that at the time the people would know who your spiritual director was, so that if you made a decision, people would blame your spiritual director versus yourself.
Yeah, and again, that's probably autobiographical on his part, too, huh? Blan may have felt a little bit of criticism for some of the things he was directing people to do. It's quite possible. Whenever he gets in it, because it's another one of those instances where he goes on for about 2 pages trying to defend the spirit, the reputation. He feels spiritual directors have a bad reputation, and he feels that something ought to be said to redress the balance. How applicable it would have been in the historical situation. Okay, we ready to go to Paris?
All set.
Yes.
In reference to the bottom of page 53 about the 15 minutes, etc., is that a connection with Ignatius Loyola, where he either says or wrote or reported or said that all he would require was 15 minutes of meditation to calm his submission, etc., to God's rule, even if he lost the Jesuits?
Quite possibly. At least I think we can say that was part of the spirituality of the time. That the founder often makes reference in his own writings to go to your room for a quarter of an hour or to think this over for a quarter. It recurs several times in the founder's writings that I can think of. It may well have been a practice at San Sulpice also, for them to, or that would be part of a penance, go to the chapel for a quarter of an hour, things like that. So I think that's, again, typical 17th century. It's whether he actually spent 15 minutes or not. You know, again, it's one of Bland's things that he's pulling out of. That it took him a little time to get used to the idea. Actually, it might have been a day or two, if the truth were told. Okay. Now, what should we highlight here with regard to this in the little time where notice we're getting a little bit back on schedule, not completely. We are if we finish this, but it depends on what you want to bring out here and what I think I would like to highlight. First of all are the basic lines of the story, just to get settled in Paris and the Rue Princesse. Now, this map that I just passed out, get your bearings a little bit there. Can you follow the stuff on the map?
Yes.
Where is my folder? I know I've got one here someplace. There it is. Actually, this was put together. I adapted this from a map that was published in a little Pilgrim's Guide to Paris that was produced by the French brothers for the 300th anniversary of the founder's birth in 1951, and it was reprinted afterwards for the tercentenary. So you can see all the places there. We're looking north. And number 15 is where the present Rue de Sèvres is, which is facing south. And if you go out the door of Rue de Sèvres and turn left, which would mean you're going right on this map, then you wind up in this central section of the left bank. And number 1 right there in the middle, that's where Saint Sulpice is. Number 3 right up above it in the parish that's where the school on the Rue Princesse was. And that building still stands today. It's the only building in France, it's the only building in Paris that's still standing. The General Hospice in Rouen is still there too, but it's the only building in Paris where the building is there. But we know the sites of all the other schools. So all of those places where the founder gets in trouble. For example, notice the Rue de Bac, you can see the identification there, but the school is up there, number 4. As Blanc says, very close to the Pont Royal. There's the bridge across the Seine that goes right across there. That's across to the Rue Saint-Honoré, where the founder wound up, one of his residences, and that he was on his way there one day when he fell badly. We'll see a little bit about that story a little later. If you go back to number 1, Saint-Sulpice, if you go straight across to the right, you'll see number 2, and that's where the Sorbonne was. So you can see that when the founder was studying at Saint-Sulpice, the walk to the Sorbonne was not very far. I think that's all we did. In Vaugirard, which is our work for tomorrow, if you can see that's way over on the left. It's to the west of the main part of town. It was a faubourg at the time, as we would say, a suburb, but it's now incorporated into part of the city of Paris. But you see, it wasn't so terribly far. It's kind of a straight line. That Rue de Vaugirard, by the way, the Rue runs all the way straight through, right past Saint-Sulpice. So it's a straight route to go, and it's not terribly far. Okay, so keep this with you and refer to it as you're reading. If you try to locate the places that being spoken about, it'll help make it a little more vivid and real for you.
Is number 10 still there? That's the one at the Bastille.
Oh, the Bastille is not there any longer, but this great big column where the Bastille was, but that, I put that, indicated, or they indicated that there too, I think, because, so you can see how it was relatively close to number 11.
There's one just beside the Bastille at the moment.
What?
School of Publishing.
Yes, I was just going to, I'm glad you reminded me of that, because when you asked the question, it reminded me to say something. You see where number 10 is, everybody up here at this, that's the suburb known as Saint-Antoine. And so you have the Boulevard du Faubourg Saint-Antoine, and coming off that circle where the Bastille was, is a Rue Saint-Antoine, and we have a school there. Although I understand now we no longer have any brothers teaching in it, but we still have a community. And that's where Léon Arose holds up when he's in Paris. Okay? And of course, right, just off from the Bastille is the school. It's the school known as the School of the Franc Bourgeois, because these were, and we set up a school there because the Franc Bourgeois were the bourgeois who didn't have to pay school tax. And next to that is the Church of St. Paul, which was the pastor that received the founder when he got thrown, when he had to give up the Grand Maison. And right across, if you see number 10 and go down that street a little bit, and then we're to go up a next street, which isn't on the map, that's where the Place Royale was, and that's where Barré was living in Paris. Huh? And that was where the founder would have gone. So the founder knew that area very, very well. Okay, so the history of this, Barré had left Rouen for Paris, and he still had the idea. He was delighted when he heard what was happening in Reims with De La Salle, with the schools for gratuitous schools for poor boys, that he had a stable community, and so, of course, Barré was trying to tell the founder. He was the one who advised him to give up his canonry, to trust Providence and everything else, and very pleased with everything that was happening. Barré is encouraging the founder to come to Paris. By this time, the pastor of the parish is de la Barmondière, who was one of the spiritual directors when the founder was in the seminary. We are now, what, in 1688, the founder was there 16 years earlier than that, 17 years earlier. So his former teacher or former director or former faculty member anyway is now the pastor, a very spiritual man apparently, but a very much of an ultramontane. He's the one who said that if anybody voted for those Gallican articles that the king was imposing, that he'd commit a mortal sin. And he's the one who wrote his doctoral dissertation and defended the thesis that the Pope is personally infallible. But he was a good man, and he wanted De La Salle to come, and all of that business that we read in the previous book about everybody was pushing De La Salle to come. He had made a promise to De La Barmondière, apparently, to send brothers. Barré wanted him to come, and so on. But Jacques Callot said, no, stay here. You've got to get the thing more solidly founded in Reims first. So there was pressure from them, and the pressure was a promise. Now his own Archbishop Letellier offers then to take over the whole operation of the schools, to provide all the money they needed, to give them stability and so on, if he would limit his operation to the city of Reims. And I think that's where, for the first time, he kind of begins to see that, especially with the pressure from Barré, that no, it's more important to go to Paris. It's the capital after all. Blain says, prematurely again, that this was the route to Rome to get permission to take the vows and to get the vows and turn into an order. So, well, he's not thinking that way at all. I think Blain misses completely the originality of what it was the founder was organizing. So this thing of Letellier, and again, it would be basing the schools not on Providence, but on one particular archbishop. And De La Salle was experienced enough in the ways of ecclesiastics to know that that whole thing could collapse the minute we got a new bishop, as happens very often even to us still today. So that was another motive that he had for getting there. The negotiations, however, take over a long time. They go over a long period. It's a little difficult to trust Blain completely on this, especially with regard to the role of his own brother, who was in the seminary at the time, Jean-Louis. If you look at page 70, the bottom of that top paragraph, Now, the whole thing here is apparent. I never have been able to understand this completely. Maybe Gus has an insight into it. But why was the founder so reluctant to go to Paris until he actually got the word from the horse's mouth, so to speak, from the pastor? So De La Salle wished to receive a positive word from the parish priest himself. Parish priest, of course, is the word for pastor. They don't use that expression in England, in Europe.
Who is that?
Huh?
Who's the pastor?
De la Barmondiere. To obtain this, he replied that his younger brother Louis was about to set out for the seminary of Saint-Sulpice. He would make the arrangements and take all the measures needed to conclude them. Well, Jean-Louis entered the seminary in November of 1682. That's another interesting question. When the founder moved out of the family home and sold it and moved into the Rue Neuve, did his own brother go with him? Probably he did, because we know from the entry from the records in Saint-Sulpice that Jean-Louis de La Salle entered Saint-Sulpice in November 1682. So that would have been considerably before this. And he left, and he finished his courses at the Sorbonne in 1686. So Louis, it's wrong to say, was setting out for the seminary, and he would make the arrangements. So he was there in the early stages of this negotiation, but he could not have played a significant role as it was coming to a conclusion. Then Compagnon is so interested in getting somebody because he's only got one assistant there with him, and he's so anxious to get the brothers, and he goes to Reims himself. De La Salle isn't there, and so it's Compagnon who takes all the initiative in the first place. And then Compagnon sends him word, maybe through Jean-Louis, maybe on his way back, that, oh, the coast is all clear. The founder won't come on that. After all, Compagnon was a priest in charge of all of the schools in the parish. Remember, way back earlier, Bland tells us that the parish of Saint-Sulpice was as big as a diocese. And when you get to Buttimer II, I think Gerard Rummery will help to indicate something of the reputation of the pastors of the parish of Saint-Sulpice, how pastoral they were and how concerned for all the things of their parish, in spite of the troubles they gave De La Salle. Why De La Salle wouldn't come without a direct word from the pastor through Compagnon, who was a priest and in charge of the schools, to me is a little bit of a mystery. So then finally, when the reason becomes clear down there, De la Barmondiere tells him, sends word through Baudrin, who was another one of his assistants at the time, that yes, he wants him to come. And then De La Salle is satisfied. So he goes to Paris with two brothers on the eve of the feast of St. Matthias. On page 70, Hernandez, those footnotes are from Hernandez, of course, the translator. He says apparently February 23rd. Actually, it's February 24th because 1688 was a leap year. And so in leap year, the Feast of Matthias is on the 25th, or used to be. Yeah?
You know, about that Compagnon, why you didn't obey him right away or follow him, I kind of read that as an insight on the fact that this guy was a character, as he proved to be later on.
Yeah.
And he didn't trust him.
It's quite possible.
And I even
Yeah.
took his being absent that time when he came as an excuse not to have to deal with the character.
Yeah, that's a good insight. I had never thought of that. He might, the word might have gotten back to him either through his brother or the contacts he had in Saint-Sulpice, that this guy is not dependable and you better not have much to do with him.
Yeah.
Because he certainly turns out to be one of the bad guys in this dramatic presentation. Right, so then we have the whole sad story of the situation once they get there anyway. Once they get there, the whole, from February to April, the pastor isn't even aware what's going on in the school. The founder is there with the two brothers. Compagnon is running the show. This other fellow is running the hosiery thing. The kids are coming and going at will. The place is utter chaos, a kind of a zoo. The founder's trying to do what he can, divide them into little classes and so on, but he has no real authority. He tells the brothers, just be patient, we'll see what happens. And then finally, the pastor comes on this visit and he sees what's going on and so on and so forth. So then he takes steps to get rid of, Compagnon and to put De La Salle in charge, with Compagnon still there. And he says, well, the next man will take charge of it, and the next man is Father Baudrin, who succeeds De la Barmondiere as the pastor. and then De La Salle takes Baudrin as his spiritual director. So who was it that asked about the ecclesiastical authority? That's the answer to that, Chris, that he then becomes his permanent spiritual director, okay, replacing Calou, who was no longer available to him. So, and of course he knew Baudrin, he knew his reputation from Saint-Sulpice, because he was one of the major spiritual directors when the founder was in the seminary there. And so Baudrin becomes his spiritual director. And he has the same problems with Baudrin, of course, as that he did. So Baudrin is both his ecclesiastical superior and is in charge of the parish and everything in it, huh? So in that sense, he's his ecclesiastical superior, if that's your question. Is it?
Well, yeah, so legally what that meant, if you know what that meant.
Pastor of the parish. Okay? Yeah, okay? That's all it really means. And the school was dependent on the pastor. And Boutet has that whole big thing about the importance of the pastor in relationship to schools, and the importance of the deal that the founder made with the pastor when he began to open schools and so on. Okay?
The literature says that Compagnon's assistant was running a factory, and I'm it doesn't matter too much, quite confused as to whether it was stockings or toques or linen or what, but it's supposed to have been a factory. Wow.
Well, a factory, of course, this is prior to the Industrial Revolution. All it would mean would be a room with all the tools they needed and the necessity things to, it wouldn't have been a factory in the sense of General Motors or something, with an assembly line or anything like that, but they were training these kids to be able to make, they were probably making stockings of various kinds. Probably had a big sale with the clergy that they wore under their robes instead of pants. But now, if we've all read this, I don't think it's necessary to go through all the stories. But three significant things occur here. Huh? First of all, it's interesting that there's again great drama, isn't there, between the whole business of Compagnon resenting the founder's influence, but the minute the founder is put in charge, he takes over. And it turns immediately into a first-class school with good discipline, locking the doors so they can't get in. Maybe we should try that in some of our schools instead of having the vice principal or whoever does it giving out late passes and things like that, because then you wouldn't be able to collect the fines. But locking the doors so they couldn't get in, then locking them so they couldn't get out. And gambling apparently is he makes the point of that, and it seems to be some background for it, that these kids were gambling, and they had no garden, they just had a little courtyard, and when they weren't making stockings or paying attention to the inept school teacher, they'd be out gambling like crazy. Then Bland pushes another button about what's this terrible vice of gambling and the root of everything else. Well, I don't, again, compulsive gamblers can be a problem, but whether all those kids were is another question. Okay, so, but now Baudrin is so pleased with the success of this school that he decides now it's time to open another one in his parish on the Rue du Bac, which is, you see it there on the map of the school is number 4. And now, this is a little bit out of the center of the parish, but it's still in the parish. All of that whole area was the parish of Saint-Sulpice. And so apparently the school was very close to where one of these schoolmasters, now Bland says the whole corporation went after him, but apparently in this particular locality, the school was definitely intruding on the territory of one of the schoolmasters who had been assigned to that particular territory. And so this is the first instance of schoolmasters ganging up on the founder. Now I'd like to talk a little bit more about that at length, and to comment on the memoir and the habit, let's say a little bit more about that, and let's look a little more closely at the loss of these two brothers. And so we'll start with that tomorrow, the tail end of today's assignment. That shouldn't take very long, so by the time we get to tomorrow, we should be pretty much back onto the lectures will correspond a little more closely to the assigned readings. Okay?